it is scrumptious. It is scrumptious.
Crunches, when it crunches, that's why I love Nestle Crunch.
Water is a foodstuff like any other and should have a market value. Peter Brabeck sits in his Swiss boardroom, hands folded, delivering this statement to a camera crew in 2005. He's the chairman of Nestle, the world's largest food company. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows frame the pristine waters of Lake Geneva. What he doesn't mention is that at this very moment, Nestle trucks are pumping millions of gallons from drought-stricken California. Or that in Pakistan, their operations have left entire villages walking miles for clean water. Or that in Michigan, they're extracting fresh groundwater while residents in nearby Flint drink from bottles because their taps run poison. If you're watching, comment the word stolen. That's how we'll know you're one of the few people who question the official version. The transformation of water from a public good into private profit didn't happen overnight. It required decades of strategic acquisitions, regulatory capture, and a fundamental shift in how humanity thinks about its most essential resource. In 1992, Nestle's water division was a footnote in their annual reports. By 2018, it was generating over $7 billion in revenue. The company had quietly assembled the world's largest collection of water brands: Poland Spring, Pure Life, Perrier, San Pellegrino, Deer Park, Ice Mountain. Each bottle representing a small victory in a much larger war. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. While governments debated infrastructure and public health, Nestle was securing water rights. While environmentalists focused on industrial pollution, Nestle was drilling wells. While communities struggled with aging municipal systems, Nestle was marketing fear. The business model that emerged was almost too perfect. Take water from the ground for free or nearly free. Add a plastic bottle that costs pennies to manufacture. Slap on a label promising purity, health, convenience. Sell it back to the same communities you extracted it from at markups of 2,000 to 3,000%. But the real genius wasn't in the margins. It was in the messaging. By the early 2000s, Nestle's marketing departments had perfected the art of manufacturing distrust. Television commercials showed families choosing bottled water over tap water for their children's safety. Print ads highlighted rare but scary stories of municipal water contamination. Focus groups revealed that parents would pay almost anything to ensure their children's health. The irony was staggering. In many cases, the bottled water was sourced from the same municipal systems the marketing was teaching people to fear. The FDA's regulations for bottled water were often less stringent than EPA standards for tap water. But perception became reality. Fear became profit. Michael O'Heaney worked as a regulatory affairs manager for Nestle Waters North America from 2003 to 2009. He watched the company's internal transformation from the inside. There was a shift in language, he recalls. We stopped talking about water as a resource and started talking about it as an asset. We stopped talking about communities and started talking about markets. The legal department grew faster than any other division. O'Heaney's job was to navigate the complex web of local, state, and federal regulations governing water extraction. What he discovered was a system designed to be exploited. In most states, water rights operate under the rule of capture or reasonable use doctrines. If you own the land, you can extract the water beneath it, often with minimal oversight. For a company with the resources to purchase land near aquifers, this represented an almost unlimited opportunity. We had teams of hydrologists, lawyers, and land scouts, O'Heaney explains. Their job was to identify locations where we could secure long-term extraction rights at the lowest possible cost. The sweet spot was areas with abundant groundwater but limited local political opposition. The company's internal documents, obtained through public records requests, reveal a methodical approach to resource acquisition. Nestle targeted rural communities, native reservations, and economically disadvantaged areas where local governments might welcome the promise of jobs and tax revenue. The contracts they negotiated were masterpieces of corporate law. In many cases, Nestle secured extraction rights for decades in advance, often paying less per gallon than local residents paid for their municipal water. The agreements frequently included clauses that allowed the company to increase extraction volumes without additional approval, regardless of changing environmental conditions. But it was the timing that made the strategy so effective. As climate change began to create more frequent and severe droughts, as aging infrastructure led to more municipal water crises, as public distrust of government institutions grew, Nestlé was positioning itself as the solution to problems it had helped create. The California drought of 2012 to 2016 became a case study in how this dynamic played out in real time. As Governor Jerry Brown imposed mandatory water restrictions on residents, limiting lawn watering and car washing, Nestlé continued to extract 36 million gallons annually from the San Bernardino National Forest. The company's permits for this extraction had expired in 1988, but they continued pumping under a legal loophole that allowed pending applications to maintain operations indefinitely. Local activists like Amanda Fry began organizing protests. People were letting their lawns die to save water, she remembers. Families were taking shorter showers, collecting rainwater, doing everything they could to comply with the drought restrictions. Meanwhile, Nestlé was trucking out millions of gallons every day to bottle and sell back to Californians. The optics were devastating. News helicopters captured footage of Nestlé trucks lined up at the extraction site while nearby forests showed the brown scars of wildfire damage. Environmental groups calculated that Nestlé's annual extraction was equivalent to the water usage of 400 average households. But the company's response revealed the sophistication of their public relations apparatus. Rather than defend their extraction volumes, Nestlé pivoted to attacking the framing of the debate itself. Agriculture uses 80% of California's water. Their spokeswoman Kim Jeffrey told reporters, "We use less than 0.01%. The real issue isn't bottled water companies. It's the fundamental question of how California allocates its water resources." The statement was technically accurate. It was also a masterful deflection. By reframing the debate from corporate responsibility to resource allocation policy, Nestlé had shifted the conversation away from their specific practices to the broader complexities of water management. This same playbook was deployed around the world, adapted to local contexts but following the same basic pattern. Secure extraction rights, maximize volumes, deflect criticism, privatize profits while socializing costs. In Pakistan, Nestlé's Pure Life brand became the country's leading bottled water company by targeting areas where municipal water systems were unreliable. The company's local subsidiary, Nestlé Pakistan, established extraction facilities in Punjab and Sindh provinces, often in areas already facing water stress. Dr. Arshad Chandio, a hydrologist at the University of Sindh, documented the environmental impact of these operations. The large-scale extraction of groundwater for commercial bottling has lowered water tables in surrounding areas, his research found. Local farmers have had to dig deeper wells. Some villages have been forced to truck in water for basic needs. The human cost was harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. In the village of Bit Shah, residents reported that their traditional wells had dried up within 3 years of Nestlé beginning operations nearby. The company's extraction permits allowed them to pump 1.5 million liters daily, while the village's 3,000 residents struggled to access clean water for drinking and cooking. When confronted with these reports, Nestlé's local management employed the same deflection tactics used in California. Water scarcity is a complex issue requiring government-level solutions. Their country manager, Samer Chedid, told the Dawn newspaper, "Our operations are fully compliant with local regulations and contribute to economic development in these regions." The regulatory compliance claim was technically true, but it highlighted a fundamental problem with the global water governance system. In most countries, water extraction regulations were written for agricultural or small-scale commercial use. They weren't designed to manage large-scale industrial extraction by multinational corporations. This regulatory gap became Nestlé's competitive advantage. While local businesses faced restrictions on water usage during droughts or shortages, Nestlé's long-term contracts often exempted them from emergency conservation measures. While municipal water systems struggled with aging infrastructure and limited budgets, Nestlé invested in state-of-the-art extraction and purification technology. The result was a two-tier system where access to clean water increasingly depended on economic status rather than geographic location or government provision. Nowhere was this dynamic more visible than in the response to the Flint water crisis. In 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan, switched its water source from Lake Huron to the Flint River as a cost-saving measure. The river water was more corrosive than the previous source, and the city failed to add proper corrosion control chemicals. Lead from aging pipes began leaching into the water supply, creating a public health emergency that would affect over 100,000 residents. As news of the contamination spread, residents turned to bottled water for drinking, cooking, and bathing. Store shelves emptied. Emergency distribution centers were established. The governor declared a state of emergency. Just 120 miles away, in Mecosta County, Nestle was operating one of its largest extraction facilities in North America. The company's Ice Mountain brand was pumping 400 gallons per minute from a well system that tapped into the same Great Lakes watershed that had previously supplied Flint's water. The juxtaposition was stark. Flint residents were lining up for free bottled water donations while Nestle extracted millions of gallons from nearby sources and sold it back to Michigan residents at retail prices. Leon Walters, a Flint resident who became a leading activist in exposing the water crisis, describes the psychological impact of this reality. You're looking at your children's rashes from bathing in poisoned water, you're buying cases of bottled water you can't afford, and you know that a corporation is making money off the same water that used to come out of your tap for free. But the Flint crisis also revealed the deeper structural issues that made Nestle's business model possible. The city's decision to switch water sources was driven by financial desperation. Years of population decline, industrial job losses, and municipal budget cuts had left Flint's infrastructure underfunded and deteriorating. This wasn't an accident. It was the predictable result of decades of policy choices that prioritized short-term cost savings over long-term infrastructure investment. As public water systems struggled with deferred maintenance and aging equipment, private companies like Nestle offered an alternative that appeared cheaper and more efficient. The economic logic was seductive. Why should cash-strapped municipalities invest billions in upgrading water treatment plants when private companies could provide bottled water to residents who could afford it? Why should taxpayers fund universal access to clean water when the market could allocate resources more efficiently? These questions weren't just being asked in Flint. They were being debated in boardrooms and policy circles around the world. And increasingly, the answers were favoring privatization. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other global financial institutions began promoting private sector involvement in water services as a condition for development loans. Countries facing debt crises were encouraged to sell water rights to foreign companies as a way to generate revenue and attract investment. Nestle was perfectly positioned to benefit from this shift. The company had the capital to acquire water rights, the technology to extract and process water efficiently, and the global distribution networks to reach markets anywhere in the world. But they also had something equally important: the political connections and lobbying power to shape the policy environment in their favor. Susan Wellington joined Nestle's government affairs team in 2008 after a career in environmental consulting. Her job was to monitor regulatory developments and advocate for policies that supported the company's water business. There was a very sophisticated understanding of how policy gets made, she recalls. We had staff in Washington, Brussels, and Geneva who tracked every piece of water-related legislation. We funded research that supported our positions. We built relationships with regulators and policymakers. One of Wellington's key responsibilities was managing Nestle's relationship with the International Bottled Water Association, an industry group that lobbied against restrictions on water extraction and quality standards that might favor tap water over bottled water. The association's lobbying efforts were remarkably successful. In the United States, the FDA's bottled water regulations remained largely unchanged for decades, even as scientific understanding of water contamination and environmental impacts evolved. In Europe, the European Union's bottled water directive included exemptions for natural mineral water that allowed companies like Nestle to market their products as inherently superior to tap water. But perhaps the most important victory was rhetorical. Through lobbying, research funding, and public relations campaigns, the bottled water industry had successfully reframed the debate about water access from a question of public policy to a matter of consumer choice. This reframing was crucial because it made opposition to water privatization seem anti-market rather than pro-public health. Critics of Nestlé's practices weren't defending a public good. They were opposing consumer freedom and economic efficiency. The strategy worked because it aligned with broader ideological trends favoring market solutions over government intervention. But it also worked because it obscured the real costs of water privatization. Those costs weren't just environmental, though the environmental impact was severe. The production of plastic bottles required significant energy and resources. The transportation of bottled water created carbon emissions. The disposal of empty bottles contributed to plastic pollution in oceans and landfills. The costs weren't just economic, though the economic impact was substantial. The shift from public to private water systems transferred wealth from communities to shareholders. It created a regressive tax where the poor paid more for water than the rich, since bottled water was far more expensive per gallon than tap water. The deepest costs were social and political. The privatization of water undermined the social contract that had made universal access to clean water a cornerstone of modern democracy. It normalized the idea that access to life's essentials should depend on ability to pay rather than citizenship or human need. And it created a vicious cycle where the deterioration of public water systems justified further privatization, which reduced political support for public investment, which led to further deterioration. Dr. Maud Barlow, a Canadian activist who has studied water privatization globally, describes this dynamic as the commons under siege. In her research, she's documented how water privatization creates what economists call market failure, situations where private companies have incentives that conflict with public welfare. When water is treated as a commodity, companies have an incentive to create scarcity, Barlow explains. Scarcity drives up prices. It increases demand for their products. It reduces political support for public alternatives. This incentive structure explains many of the seemingly contradictory aspects of Nestlé's water business. The company's marketing emphasized the scarcity and danger of tap water, while their operations often contributed to actual water scarcity. Their public relations departments promoted environmental stewardship, while their extraction practices damaged local ecosystems. The contradictions weren't accidental. They were the logical result of a business model that profited from the problems it helped create. By 2018, this model had made Nestlé the world's largest bottled water company, with operations in more than 50 countries and annual revenues exceeding $7 billion. But it had also created a powerful coalition of opposition. Environmental groups, community activists, indigenous rights organizations, and public health advocates began coordinating their efforts to challenge Nestlé's practices. They used Freedom of Information Act requests to expose the company's internal documents. They organized boycotts of Nestlé products. They lobbied for stronger regulations on water extraction. Most importantly, they began to tell a different story about water. Instead of accepting the framing of water as a commodity, they insisted on water as a human right. Instead of debating the efficiency of private versus public provision, they questioned whether essential resources should be owned by corporations at all. This counter-narrative gained momentum as the consequences of climate change made water scarcity a more urgent concern. As droughts became more frequent and severe, as sea level rise threatened coastal freshwater supplies, as extreme weather events damaged water infrastructure, the logic of hoarding water for private profit became harder to defend. The United Nations 2010 declaration that access to clean water was a fundamental human right provided a legal and moral framework for this challenge. But the declaration was non-binding, and its implementation depended on the willingness of national governments to assert public control over water resources. Some governments began to act. In 2016, the Canadian government announced it would review all commercial water extraction permits, potentially affecting Nestlé's operations. In 2019, the European Union passed new regulations requiring environmental impact assessments for large-scale water extraction projects. But the most significant challenge came from an unexpected source: changing consumer preferences. By 2015, public awareness of plastic pollution had reached a tipping point. Images of plastic waste in the world's oceans, concerns about microplastics in the food chain, and growing environmental consciousness among younger consumers began to affect bottled water sales. Major corporations started banning single-use plastics from their offices. Restaurants began offering filtered tap water instead of bottled water. Cities installed public water fountains and encouraged residents to carry reusable bottles. For the first time in decades, Nestlé's water business faced serious competitive pressure. The company's response revealed both the strengths and limitations of their strategy. On one hand, Nestlé adapted quickly to changing market conditions. They invested in more environmentally friendly packaging, promoted recycling programs, and repositioned their brands around sustainability rather than just purity and convenience. On the other hand, these adaptations didn't address the fundamental critiques of their business model. Changing the packaging didn't change the fact that they were extracting public water resources for private profit. Promoting recycling didn't address the environmental cost of transporting water hundreds or thousands of miles from its source. More fundamentally, the focus on environmental sustainability missed the deeper issues of democratic governance and economic justice that water privatization raised. In 2021, Nestlé announced it was selling its North American bottled water brands to a private equity firm, BlueTriton, for $4.3 billion. The sale was portrayed as part of the company's strategic shift toward higher growth categories like coffee and pet food. But industry analysts understood the real reason for the sale. The bottled water business had become a liability for Nestlé's global brand. The reputational costs of defending water extraction practices increasingly outweighed the financial benefits. The sale didn't solve the underlying problems. BlueTriton continued operating the same extraction facilities under the same regulatory framework. The water rights remained in private hands. The business model remained unchanged. What had changed was the political context. The idea that water should be a public resource rather than a private commodity had gained mainstream acceptance. The question was no longer whether water privatization was efficient, but whether it was legitimate. This shift in public opinion represented a fundamental challenge to the entire bottled water industry. For decades, companies like Nestlé had succeeded by making water privatization seem natural and inevitable. They had convinced consumers that bottled water was safer, cleaner, and more convenient than tap water. They had persuaded policymakers that private companies could manage water resources more efficiently than government agencies. But this narrative was built on a foundation of manufactured scarcity and systematic disinvestment in public infrastructure. As that foundation became visible, the entire structure became vulnerable. The story of Nestlé's water empire wasn't just about one company's business practices. It was about the broader transformation of how modern societies organize access to essential resources. It was about the shift from public goods to private commodities, from democratic governance to market allocation, from collective responsibility to individual consumption. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It was the result of deliberate choices by corporations, governments, and international institutions. It was enabled by legal frameworks that prioritized property rights over human needs. It was justified by economic theories that treated water as just another input in the production process. But it was also resisted by communities, activists, and ordinary citizens who insisted that some things should not be for sale, who argued that access to clean water was a prerequisite for human dignity, not a luxury for those who could afford it. The resistance to water privatization represented something larger than environmental activism or anti-corporate sentiment. It was a challenge to the fundamental assumptions of neoliberal capitalism. It was an assertion that democratic societies had the right to manage their own resources according to their own values and priorities. The outcome of this challenge would determine not just the future of the water industry, but the future of the relationship between private power and public welfare in the 21st century. As climate change accelerated and water scarcity intensified, the stakes would only grow higher. The question was whether societies would learn from the Nestlé model or repeat it, whether they would choose to treat water as a commodity or reclaim it as a commons. The answer would shape the world their children inherited. If you made it to the end, comment stolen. Let's see how many of you actually know the real version of this story.